welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 60. I am the show's host, Kyle. Got a ton of current events for today's show. The last show, of course, was my analysis of the Putin interview, so if that's something that you would be interested in, go ahead and check that out. Foreign Policy Focus, episode 59. For those of you who like the show and want other people to stay up on current events, please take the time to share the show. It's at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And that would be very helpful in the show growing. As I said on several past episodes, the show continues to grow, and it's because people are sharing this show. So thank you so much, and let's get into the news. The first thing I want to talk about is just why having shows like this and the Scott Horton show and Around the Empire are important is because the real news made stuff up and publishes it. Recently, CNN got caught up in a pretty big lie. What happened was I think a pair of writers for CNN and then the editor who approved the story ended up resigning. Reporters used one anonymous source that apparently wasn't vetted very well. The story, complete lie. They had to retract it. They had to pull some back. The three people resigned. So I guess it's good that some of, the liars have exposed themselves and now we know and don't hopefully have to deal with the writing too much anymore. But the problem is that in a lot of ways, the narrative has already been set. The New York Times have been running stories since January saying that 17 U.S. intelligence agencies all agree that Russia hacked the DNC servers, and the New York Times recently had to remove a couple stories because that turns out not to be true. And so they've already set the narrative. Everybody knows that Russia did this because 17 intelligence services agree. But a couple months down the road, we find out that's absolutely false. Of course, I've been saying that for months now, and it's good that it's getting out there because what's happened is that this has really made it difficult for Trump to do one of the few good things that he was going to do and that's get along better with Russia. And, the more pressure there is that Russia hacked the election and there's more belief in the U.S. populace that this happened, the worse it's going to be and the harder it is for Trump to be able to kind of gain the political capital he needs to get along better with Russia. Of course, some of the good news is that I think there's a pretty good chance that Putin and Trump will be meeting maybe in private during the G20 summit that's coming up. That may be some good news on the horizon. Bad news is, the Syria thing is still a real problem, and that's making relations between the U.S. and Russia really rocky. Unfortunately, some of the good promises that we got from Trump that he was going to work with Russia and Syria and only focus on the terrorists has turned out not to be true. Now he's picking a fight with the Syrian state, and so unfortunately we're getting a very Hillary Clinton-like foreign policy when it comes to Russia. Other bad news, at least some portions of the travel ban are going to be back in effect, at least temporarily. There's already some court challenges being heard and proposing, though the Supreme Court just ruled on it. And so it does look like some probably appellate court judges that are pretty left-leaning will have a crack at the travel ban again. So I don't know how much longer it will be in effect. And there's other things going on too. A federal judge in Detroit ruled that the U.S. couldn't deport 1,400 Iraqi refugees who have been living in the U.S. for like 30 years now. I guess they were a Christian minority refugee group back from under the Saddam days, and the U.S. took them in. Their visas expired a long time ago, but they remained in the country. And a lot of these people are, in their 40s, and so they've been in America now far longer than they were ever lived in Iraq, and it was only for the first few years of their life. And, looking at the quotes of the story, the people don't really have memories of living in Iraq, and their whole lives are in the U.S. Of course, these people likely don't have any real ties left in Iraq, and who knows how many of them actually speak Arabic or are fluent in whatever dialect is in the region of Iraq that they're in. So sending them back would be really horrendous for their lives, and so looking for ways to have some sort of sense on this issue would be absolutely great. As I alluded to before, the U.S. is causing more problems in Syria. This was a Tuesday, so Wednesday morning this comes through, and that's the U.S. says that Assad is planning a chemical weapons attack, and if he goes through with it, the U.S. will retaliate against him. Of course, the first idea of this is this report didn't come out until I think 10:30 at night or so is when I saw the timestamp on the press release. So that was interesting. Usually these things occur during the day. It was originally reported, I believe, by Nancy Youssef, who at one point in time did some really good work in journalism, but lately I've been questioning some of the stuff she's putting out, including this article that said that nobody in the Trump administration knew about this other than Trump. It was a pure White House thing. What comes out later is that senior administration had a hand in crafting the letter, and apparently it sounds like they pulled Trump out for more hawkish rhetoric. Maybe Trump was going to make an explicit threat like towards Assad or something like, "We will kill you if you carry out this attack," and so it just comes off as a more blunt warning saying that, the U.S. will do something in retaliation if Syria carries out a chemical weapons attack. So right after the press release gets put out, we have Nikki Haley sending out a tweet that says that any chemical weapons attack that occurs in Syria will assume to be Assad. And so, this seems like a completely stupid thing to say if you're, like a foreign diplomat, because if you guarantee that Assad's going to get blamed for it, it's really going to prompt the Syrian rebels, who are going to lose a Syrian civil war unless the U.S. gets more involved, to carry out a false flag chemical weapons attack in order to, draw the U.S. into battle with the Assad regime. And so, openly stupid thing. She also ends the tweet by saying that Iran and Russia are responsible for this because they are Assad allies. Of course, you have to, ask yourself, by using that same logic, the U.S. is allies with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, and so what kind of crimes are of ISIS is the U.S. responsible for? ISIS has certainly dipped some people in acid and set some people on fire, and so I just think, maybe should be a little more clear in her morality. Nikki Haley, of course, has been completely reckless on the foreign policy stage. Has to be one of the worst diplomats in history. Everything she says is hawkish. Everything is an attack. And a lot of it isn't even well researched or well thought out. And then after a couple days go by, and so this morning I see stories saying that both James Mattis and Nikki Haley are saying that the Trump warning to Assad on chemical weapons prevented Assad from carrying out a chemical weapons attack. That, of course, assumes that there was ever a chemical weapons attack planned in the first place. On Monday's show, I really went into detail about how the August 4th attack wasn't a Syrian chemical weapons attack. Seymour Hersh, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, just put out a huge article on this. And so, either listen to my show or check out his article for more on that. And so even if there is a chemical weapons attack now, due to the Haley tweet, you really have to wonder if it's a false flag attack. The Syrian government has allowed weapons inspectors in their country to look for traces of chemical weapons, and apparently nothing's been found. From everything that I've read reporting-wise, it seems like after the 2013 false flag chemical weapons attack, when the Syrian rebels tried to use sarin gas and killed like 1,000 people to bait the U.S. into war, then Putin then agreed to take all of Assad's chemical weapons in order to ensure that chemical weapons were no longer used in Syria. Of course, Assad never, admitted to being guilty of carrying out the chemical weapons attack. And key work by Timothy Postel at MIT actually was really important in proving that was a false flag and not an Assad attack. And so, but Assad did get rid of all the chemical weapons he had at that time. Everything happened above board. Definitely all the chemical weapons are gone. But the U.S. continues to make this claim because of Obama's red line that really set this idea that if chemical weapons are used in Syria, then the U.S. has to escalate and get more involved in the situation. One thing I've talked about in the past that I want to clarify, and that's about Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Now, to my understanding, that was a mutual defense pact saying that all countries would come to the aid of another country when attacked. According to Dan McAdams, who of course is, I believe, runs the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, said that it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and it's not a binding agreement that the U.S. would have to go in defense of somebody else. And several House congressmen like Thomas Massey are working very hard to prevent any sort of language going into like the U.S. code, saying that the U.S. has to go to war for another NATO member. Of course, I've talked about on previous shows how I doubt that a country like Estonia would come to the aid of the United States if the United States was attacked by Russia, and it really not making sense for other countries, and everybody's getting the better end of the NATO deal than the United States. The U.S. also agreed to sell $1.4 billion in weapons to Taiwan. Obama sold Taiwan a bunch of weapons. I think there's some THAAD anti-ballistic missile systems in Taiwan now, so I think Taiwan is similar to maybe in Israel in almost a U.S. satellite state where they just receive so much arms and weapons from the United States that allows them to be propped up and bigger, military threats than they really should be in the region. We have the NSA's Mike Rogers complaining that he cannot convince Trump that Russia hacked the DNC. Of course, we just saw that the New York Times had a wop-at. They're reporting on this, so just interesting that he's coming out to the media and complaining about it. Updates on the Qatar situation. Of course, what we have here is a split between Qatar and other GCC states like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, and then other Arab nations like Sudan and Egypt. These countries have withdrawn their ambassadors from Qatar. They have closed their borders, airports, ports with Qatar. They have placed kind of embargo-like conditions on Qatar and really blockaded the country. Qatar is, of course, a very small nation with a very rich and there's a lot of people living in that, kind of arid area. There's not a whole lot of farming that goes on, so almost all the food is imported. And so this has allowed Qatar to move closer to Iran and Turkey, who are filling that void that Saudi Arabia and UAE left when they withdrew their support from Qatar. So one update is Bob Corker, who heads, I think, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, says that he will block all arms sales to any GCC countries until they figure out how to work this out. Strong message. I'm not sure if this will go through or not. There's an awful lot of lobbying power on behalf of Saudi Arabia and Qatar as well. I mean, they have a very big and very powerful lobby and spend millions of dollars every year in the U.S. bribing our congressmen to sell them weapons. I would say maybe the one thing that would make this not a huge issue is that the U.S. just agreed to pretty big weapon sales with both Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and those have both passed the Senate already, so there's probably not a pressing need. But if this situation still isn't worked out, 6 months' time from now, then maybe there is going to be a problem, and they will have either push the Senate to push through these deals or maybe come to some agreement to get more U.S. weapons. The UAE ambassador to Russia said that Qatar needs to meet all demands or face sanctions and permanent isolation. Very bold statement, and I think it certainly reflects on kind of just that the UAE and Saudi Arabia really don't want Qatar to meet these demands, and they just want to isolate the kingdom and hope for regime change there, I guess would be my guess at what they're hoping for. The demands include stop funding for terrorists, which both the UAE and Saudi Arabia do, and they demand that Qatar shut down Al Jazeera, which publishes news that is sometimes less critical of Iran than Saudi Arabia likes, but still very critical of Iran. It's not pro-Iranian news outlet or anything like that. Saudi Arabia also doesn't like that Qatar funds both Hamas in Israel and the Muslim Brotherhood in various areas around the Middle East. Qatar has said that they're willing to discuss some legitimate issues with other countries. Of course, the deadline for the Saudi and UAE ultimatum is July 3rd, so I don't know if negotiations could happen all that much in between time now. But maybe this Qatari willingness to talk will allow them to push back that deadline. I'm not sure what Qatar is willing to give up when it says discuss legitimate issues. Maybe they'll be willing to move further away from Iran, but they share pretty large natural gas fields with Iran, so that may cause some problems. Qatar may not be able to move away from Iran just financially because of the situation that will create over those natural gas fields. They may be willing to negotiate on some funding for less and not really extremist groups, but politically extreme Islamist groups within the Middle East, like the Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas. Of course, Saudi Arabia and Egypt both aren't big fans of the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood ended up in power in Egypt after the overthrow of, I believe, Mubarak. And Hamas is a problem for Israel, and so I guess from the UAE and Egypt point, it'll score points in Israel's book if they're able to cut out some funding for Hamas. I don't know if the UAE and Saudi Arabia are willing to negotiate. I really do think that their plan is to draw a red line and try to get a new leadership within Qatar. Some news out of North Korea. One, Trump says that North Korea must be dealt with rapidly. Of course, he likes those kind of ridiculous words that really don't mean anything relative to him. Is just is going to be huge. I'm going to do it rapidly. The gears of government move very slowly, so I doubt Trump's going to be able to overcome that. But I'm sure North Korea perceives it as a threat, and it is a very threatening sounding gesture and definitely something the President of the United States shouldn't be saying. We also know that McMaster has presented Trump with more options on how to act against North Korea militarily. I'm sure that plans are drawn up against multiple countries on how the U.S. would take them out, but it seems like McMaster kind of said to Trump, hey, if at any time you want to hit go, these are the ways we could do it. In Afghanistan, we have the Taliban switching sides to ISIS, two different tribes that were loyal to the Taliban ended up switching to ISIS. I guess the tribes are ruled by tribal elders who really don't care between the Taliban and ISIS and are willing to just kind of take the side of who's ever winning. I guess the important part of this story is that at least on the ground, the civilian population seems to think that ISIS is becoming more powerful in Afghanistan. Of course, I posted on Kyle's Files, I believe last week, a very important article which details the history of ISIS in Afghanistan. It's actually some Pakistani refugees that came to the area. Marines have returned to the Helmand province of Afghanistan, and they're looking to establish relations from late in the 2000s during the Obama surge that they made. It should be just clear evidence of the futility of America's war here is that if we're going back a few years later to do the same thing we just did, it seems absolutely ridiculous, and that somebody like Trump this is what he promised to do, is to do something differently, and he's just doing the exact same thing. During the month of Ramadan in Afghanistan, 230 civilians were killed during terror attacks. I think this is just important in showing like what it's like to be an Afghani citizen. Imagine, a month of celebration, kind of like the winter month or the week between maybe Christmas and New Year's in America. There's a lot of terrorist attacks during that time. I'm sure it impacts Americans a lot more because there's a lot of travel and stuff and celebration going on, and then there's this huge cloud hanging over everybody's head, and there's less work going on, and so people are able to pay more attention. And when you have this kind of situation during this time, I'm sure it does really undermine, one, the Afghani government, but just how big of a failure America's mission in Afghanistan has been. We have 10 more Afghani police being killed by the Taliban. I'm not sure if this was one of those green to blue attacks or if it was just another, ambush by the Taliban against the Afghani police. News coming out of Syria. The first thing I want to address is that we had Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who, of course, I believe was the chief of staff to Colin Powell when he was under Bush, and recently appeared on the Tom Woods show and actually isn't a super hawk anyways. But I think he made a really bad argument on MSNBC, and I just wanted to address it. What Wilkerson argues is that the U.S. doesn't need to do anything to prevent the Baghdad-Damascus highway from being linked up because the Sunni tribal forces will be able to fight back against it. Of course, what he's saying is basically this is going to be an insurgency against the Iraqi and Syrian governments, an Iraqi government that the United States claims to support. So that has to just be a huge problem on the face of it for this issue. Also, not to mention, it just doesn't seem true to me if the United States isn't involved in Syria and Iraq, that highway could flow. I mean, south of the area, there's the Syrian desert, but the Syrian government could certainly control that. Assad has released 672 detainees. I think this happened right at the end of Ramadan, a lot of these detainees were former members of the Syrian insurgency revolution against Assad. So I think Assad is trying to give the people some semblance that the Syrian war is winding down with that move. The U.S. bombed an ISIS prison, killing 15 ISIS fighters and 42 others. At least some of these people were civilians. I'm not sure how many of the prisoners were actually people who should be imprisoned, and how many were somebody who smoked a cigarette or a woman who didn't wear a headscarf in public or something like that. The situation in ISIS-controlled territory, you're not necessarily a prisoner or a criminal just because you're a prisoner. I mean, just like in today's America, right, you have millions of people rotting in jail for smoking weed. Completely ridiculous. And so the U.S. bombs this target, and I think whenever it isn't a prison that we could that the American people thinks are able to live past it, but we really shouldn't, because prisoners in these Middle Eastern countries, a lot of times they could be the best people out there. They could be the people that were willing to stand up to power in a peaceful way, and that's why they ended up in jail. Between May 23rd and June 23rd, the U.S. coalition killed 137 Syrian children during that time in their bombing campaigns. Just another absolute tragedy. I don't know how much more detail I could go into all these bombings and killings. I mean, the U.S. just continues to rack up deaths in Syria, and all the hatred and anti-Americanism is hating in Syria. Certainly no benefit to the American people, but just the immorality of the issue. Just the fact, that we've killed so many people overseas that a large portion of our population is afraid that people are going to come back here and kill us. It says a lot about what's going on today. There's a lot of concern about fighting breaking out between the YPG and Turkey in northern Syria. There's two places this might happen. One is the Turkish Afrin enclave, which is kind of in north-central Syria, borders Turkey, and it's always been an issue because, there's not a lot of friends for the Kurds on any sides up there, but they are able, I guess, to control the area, and Turkey's not happy about it. There's also the, bigger YPG-controlled area in northwest Syria where they share a border with Turkey. The U.S. is trying to prevent fighting from breaking out basically by putting special operations forces right in the middle of it and hoping that both sides aren't willing to shoot as our special operation forces. The Kurds have said that if Turkey moves forward, they will hit back against Turkey, and Turkey has acted offensively against the Kurds in the past, so there's no guarantee that they won't. This will, of course, be a huge problem for the United States. I think northwest Syria is more Kurdish area than Raqqa, and so if the YPG is being attacked in the north, they'll probably commit less resources and fighters to taking Raqqa in the south, which the YPG and SDF forces have now surrounded ISIS in Raqqa, with leaving about 100,000 civilians left in the city. I'm not sure how many fighters there are in that city. 30 people in Afghanistan are in Syria, were killed by a cluster bomb. It's not known yet who dropped the cluster bomb. I have some people telling me it was probably Russia, but we'll have to find out in the coming days whenever we figure out what's going on there. West Point has released a study saying that ISIS is turning back into an insurgency as it loses territory. That's what we've been saying all along. Obviously, Trump isn't going to win the war against ISIS. ISIS is an idea, the jihadist idea, the anti-American idea, the strain in the Middle East that says that the United States will continue to kill us until we fight back. A DIA report release says that the DIA claims that Russia thinks that the U.S. is pursuing regime change in Syria. While this isn't certain, hard-hitting news, because it's one organization, speculating about a country's belief towards another situation, but I think it is important just to see that the U.S. is acting this way, thinking that Russia thinks the U.S. is pursuing regime change. In the U.S., we have a National Defense Authorization Act being pushed through for, I believe, 2017 is the one going through now. An amendment that has been proposed onto that bill will make Iraqi Kurdish fighters receiving support from the U.S. dependent on the Kurds remaining part of Iraq. I'm assuming this is to denounce the Kurdish vote for independence towards the end of September. Iraqi forces say they're within days of the victory in Mosul. Of course, victory in Mosul only means a defeat of the Islamic State, but not necessarily a reduction of ISIS and terrorist attacks going on in the city. The Iraqi forces have recaptured the ruins of the Al-Nuri Mosque. That is, of course, where Baghdadi delivered his sermon declaring the caliphate. And just to end the show with a bit of good news, a portion of the FARC-Colombia peace deal has been completed. That is the big deal. That is the disarmament of the FARC fighters. And so we are moving towards peace in Colombia. And with that is just a reminder that if we can ever convince people that peace is what is, preferable, it's what's profitable, it's what's morally right, it's the best way to go about the world. It's trade and happiness, and we all get along, and, I sell you my stuff, you sell me your stuff, and that's the way we care about things. And so if you want to do that, please share the show. If you like the show, I'm on Facebook at Kyle's Files. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. The website is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And, my website is kylesfilesaball.com. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.